this afternoon. Esther, chapter number 2. I hope y'all are praying for us. Some of y'all are smiling and grinning. I'll say this, if it were not for our commitment to sequential, expository, verse-by-verse preaching, this chapter would be skipped. It's difficult. It's difficult to explain. It's difficult to hear. It's harder to comprehend. It leaves us a plethora of perplexing questions. We'll probably have more questions today than we have answers. But I have to tell you that grasping some of these earlier influences are key to understanding God's providential protection for his people in the latter chapters. And so we can't skip them. We'll just start reading and see what the Lord has for us in chapter 2 of the book of Esther. The text says here, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Then said the king's servants that ministered to him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, and to the house of the women, under the custody of Hegai the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them. And let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. And the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So it came to pass, when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together to Shushan the palace, to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house, to the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women. And the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her thing, with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens which were meet to be given her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. And Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. Now when every maid's turn was come to go in to King Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months, according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purifications accomplished, to wit, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of the women. Then thus came every maiden unto the king, whatsoever she desired her to go with her out of the house of the women unto the king's house. In the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned into the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came in unto the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and that she were called by name. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing but what Hegai the appointed, and Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his house royal in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, even Esther's feast. And he made a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the state of the king. And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate Esther had not yet showed her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the day. We thank you for meeting with us. We thank you for your word, which you give us for instruction. We pray today, Lord, that you would give us understanding in these complex passages, Lord, that you would open our hearts and minds to hear your word and to apply what you would have for us. Lord, as we look into your word, we ask for your instruction, for your wisdom, for your guidance and grace. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, I mentioned last week that you should read this entire book, and you should sit down and you should read all 10 chapters in a single setting because it was necessary to understand the context. And I hope you've done your homework assignment, because the book of Esther is written to understand its meaning. You really need to study it in the appropriate literary format. This is not what your English teacher in school would tell you to do. You really need to turn and read the end of the book before you start at the beginning. So when I tell you you need to understand the format, I mean to say that knowing the eventual outcome, knowing the end of the story, really is critical in this case to our understanding of the beginning. It's critical for us to know the end so that we can correctly interpret the intermediate events. It's almost as if you need to read the end first so that you know what to expect. That is very, very different from how we normally study history. History, you have a list of dates, and they all happen in sequential order. It's different from how we study the epistles of Paul, where Paul gives us the doctrine first, and then he gives us the application last. But here we must know the ultimate ending of these events in order to correctly think about how the author presents to us the information. And it's critical to how we apply these challenging, perplexing, difficult lessons in our own life. So if you look at chapter 1, we summarize that chapter with the title, The Empire Strikes Back. God is still working to bring about his outcome for his people. And so in this section, we'll see that God is still working, in spite of his flawed people, to carry out his promises through his providence. And it's most easily described with another familiar story that you know, with which it has many similarities. In chapter 2, I describe as Beauty and the Beast. Again, we'll introduce 2 new characters this week. I'll remind you of the incorrigible king. But this week, we're introduced to 2 new characters. We introduced to you 2 Jewish characters, one named Mordecai and one named Esther. But let's remind ourselves of the contributors. We're again reminded of this carnal king in verses 1 through 4. In the opening verse here, we see a carnal king that is looking for comfort. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti. He's looking for comfort and what she had done and what was decreed against her. His wrath now is appeased and he wants to be comforted. Xerxes, as we'll see at the end of the chapter, Xerxes has gone back to Greece. He's picked up the grudge that his dad left for him, and he has suffered a humiliating defeat by the Athenians. Greece has sent him packing. Greece has sent him licking his wounds in 480. Just like Daddy Darius, he has been ultimately defeated by the Grecians, and now he has returned back home to Persia to lick his wounds. He's defeated. He's been dishonored. And when he comes home, he finds his home has been deserted. Oh, not because his queen has left, but because he has banished her. The king is lonely. Lonely because of his own decisions. Remember, as we said last week, sin makes us stupid. Drinking makes us dumb. Haste makes us do some dumb things, and dumb things often, as we were pointed out in Sunday school, things that really can't be undone later. As it is the law of the Medes and the Persians, the king's rules, the king's laws cannot be changed. So he's looking for comfort, and as he did in chapter 1, he's listening to bad advice. Verse number 2, then said the king's servants that ministered to him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. Listening to bad advice yet again. That lesson has not been learned. These servants, if you'll remember from chapter 1, these servants are the same 7 sleazy scumbags that we've already been introduced to in chapter 1. They're the teacup tyrants that are trying to ascend to the throne on the coattails of their family. They're attempting to influence the king in order to move up the ladder. They're looking for their own position. Knowing the king's penchant for sensual pleasure, they begin to influence him again. They want him to wield his power in a manner that influences almost every home in the kingdom. Influence every home in the kingdom for the benefit of one person, the king himself. Now, things haven't changed much in 2,500 years, have they? I mean, we say today, follow the money, don't we? We don't see this today in our society. Who stands to gain millions by the king's mandate? A pathetic advisor who has invested in a company that has the only approval. And so if we can convince the king to make a mandate, it'll affect everybody in the realm. Let's use that word, right? And if I can push that mandate, then my company that I've invested lots of money in will make millions and I'll be rich. That's no different than what these guys are doing. Let's influence him to get rid of the queen. When he looks for a new queen, then he has to look for a queen. By the way, the tradition was that Persian kings only married from one of these 7 royal families. He marries one of our daughters. And then we become more powerful. Follow the money. Things aren't any different today than they were then, right? And so we have the king here leveling a new mandate. We see in verse 3, the king's officers should be sent to gather up fair young virgins from all over the region and gather them into the palace of Susa. Place these pretty young girls into the custody of Hegai. Hegai here, it's the same as Hegai in verse 15. Hegai is the one that's in charge of the training, the beautification program. We'll see more about that in a few moments. So the king's decree, all of your qualifying children are now mine. Let's pass a new law. Requirements, we see in verse 3 as well. There's only 3 requirements. It's the 3 words, fair young virgins. They have to be pretty, they have to be young, and they have to be unmarried. This is the contest to find a new queen. And so Xerxes makes it a new law, right? The 7 advisors give him this advice. Great idea, guys. And I'm not sure why this king isn't smart enough to figure out that these 7 guys just consistently give him bad advice. I mean, he should have fired these for their poor performance. He shouldn't still be listening to them, right? I mean, hey, here I am sitting here in the palace lonely because you knuckleheads are the ones that made me kick out and banish the queen in the first place. Oh, by the way, the war that I just lost in Greece, who are my advisors? It's you knuckleheads. And now you come up with this new plan to find me. Great idea, guys. I'm going to give y'all a raise. Well, that's actually what they're hoping. They're hoping that he will find a new queen from one of their families. Let's make a new law. You see how, I mean, just in a few verses, he just builds upon what we've already seen from chapter 1. We're not going to repreach chapter 1. But now in verse 5, we'll leave this callous, carnal king, and we'll look at a caring cousin. Verse number 5, now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. I want you to see first of all his lineage. We'll spend a lot of time here because it's very important to the remainder of the story. His lineage. We start out with a statement saying that he was a certain Jew. A certain Jew indicates that Mordecai was not in his position by accident. He was known. There was a certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple. Anytime the Bible tells you there was a certain place, a certain person, that word is there on purpose. You may be certain that the word certain is there for a certain reason. And in this particular case, it's not a generic person. It is a specific man in a specific position, placed there by divine omniscience. And as is the theme throughout this entire narrative, it is the providence of God that has placed this man in this position. In Hebrew writing, whenever you find a person introduced into the narrative, the way in which they're introduced reveals something about the most important feature of that character, the most important or the most striking feature of that character. Mordecai is introduced by saying there was a certain Jew named Mordecai, and here's his family lineage. He is a son of Jair, a son of Shimei, a son of Kish, a Benjamite. The lineage of Mordecai has some very interesting names. He's a Jew, simply meaning that he is from the nation of Judah. But he was not from the tribe from which Judah gets its name. He was from the other tribe. He was a Benjamite. As we'll soon see in Sunday school, I'm sure, Judah and Benjamin are the two southern tribes. They form the southern nation of Judah, and they remain in their land about 125 years longer than the 10 northern tribes which form the nation of Israel. Israel is carried off in 722 BC. The southern two tribes, the nation of Judah, remain until 606 BC, and they're carried off into Babylon. This particular Benjamite, named Mordecai, has a father. He has a grandfather. He has a great-grandfather, and we know their names. We're given their names. It's Jair, Shimei, and Kish. Turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter number 9. I know I'm killing one of your Sunday school lessons, Brother Jason. 1 Samuel chapter number 9. The most interesting man in this lineage of Mordecai is the man named Kish. Samuel chapter number 9 in verse number 1. Now there was a man of Benjamin, a man who is also a Benjamite, whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Ephiah, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a choice young man and a goodly. And there was none among the children of Israel a goodlier person than he. From his shoulders and upwards he was higher than any of the people. And you read on in chapter number 9 of 1 Samuel, and you'll find out that this man named Kish had some livestock that was lost, and he sent his son Saul, the one that was really tall, to go looking for them. And after being gone for a few days, Saul says, we're not finding this livestock. Let's go back and report back, lest my father stops caring for the livestock and starts caring about us. And it was on this journey he met a man named Samuel. And you know what happened? He was anointed king of Israel. So this man named Kish that we read about in 1 Samuel has a son named Saul, and he becomes a mighty king. He becomes the first king of Israel. And as is so popular amongst the Hebrew nation, children are named after their ancestors. And so back in Esther chapter 2, it is likely that Kish, this great-grandfather of Mordecai, it's not the same man as the father of Saul, because that would make him much, much too old. But Mordecai's grandfather was named after one of his ancestors that is named Kish, the father of Saul. And so it's not the same Kish, but it's in the same line. I'm named after my great-great-great-great-granddad, right? You see what I'm saying? So either way, what the author here is making known to us is that Mordecai is in the lineage of the kings of Judah. Verse 6 complements that same fact. Who, this Kish, had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. So verse 6 gives us even more evidence. This who refers to Kish, not Mordecai. And that would make Mordecai over 120 years old. So we know it's not referring to Mordecai. But Kish was carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which took Jeconiah, the king of Judah. Now this Jeconiah has another name as well. His Hebrew name is Jehoiachin. That's just the difference in the Persian name and the Hebrew name. His Hebrew name is Jehoiachin. He's also called Coniah. He ruled Judah for a very short period of time. He ruled Judah for 3 months and 10 days. That narrows it down for us pretty close, doesn't it? If he's the guy that only ruled for 3 months and 10 days, and he was the one that was carried away from Jerusalem to Babylon, and Mordecai's great-granddad was carried away with this king that only ruled for 3 months and 10 days, we can get you pretty close to when Mordecai's great-granddad left Jerusalem, can't we? The details here are pretty amazing. He was 18 years old when he began to rule and did evil in the sight of the Lord. 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 15. Don't turn there. I'll read it to you. I got it printed in my notes. It's speaking of Nebuchadnezzar. He carried away Jehoiachin to Babylon, and the king's mother, and the king's wives, and his officers, and the mighty of the land. Those carried he into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon. That narrows down our time frame very explicitly. The year is 597 BC. That's the second deportation. We know exactly when Mordecai's great-granddad left Jerusalem and got carried into Babylon under the deportation. Mordecai is an exile in Persia, but he is from the proud pedigree of Benjamin. And he is in the royal line of the kings of Judah. He is straight from the lineage of King Saul. When we read 2 Kings chapter 24, we'll find out that Mordecai's family is part of the king's officers and the mighty of the land. And that point becomes extremely important in another chapter. That's why I say you have to kind of read the whole book. You have to know the end of the book to get these details. It's the point that in the next chapter is going to raise us a lot more questions that we can't answer. Let's look at his labor. In Shushan the palace, verse number 5, there was a certain Jew. Look to verse 11. Mordecai walked every day before the court of the woman's house to know how Esther did. Mordecai lives in a location described as in Shushan the palace. So I want you to see that Mordecai already has a position. He has a somewhat important job in Persia. We don't know what the job is. We're not given a detail, but we know he doesn't live in town. He doesn't live where the rest of the folks live. He lives near the palace gate because he walks in front of the palace, in front of the quarters of these women. The palace gate in Susa is another place that we have a lot of details about. It's very impressive. It's 131 feet long. It's 92 feet wide. It has 40-foot tall towers on all corners. You're familiar with the eastern gates as well. In the eastern cultures, the city gate is the principal place where decisions are made. If you have a decision that needs to be made, where do you go? You go to the gate of the city. If the city gates, the wisdom, the wise men that sit at the city gates can't decide the matter, then perhaps you get to bring it before the ruler that lives in the palace. The city gates in the eastern cultures are very much like our modern courts of law. It was the place where we know that Job, the wise man, stayed. It is the place where Lot sat in wisdom. It is the place where Boaz secured the inheritance for Ruth. It is the place where Samson slayed the enemy. It is the place where David sang his song. It is the place where Nehemiah surveyed all of his activities in the rebuilding of Jerusalem. All of this was done at the city gate. So what we know from chapter 1, verse 14 is Mordecai is not one of the seven with the daily open access to the king's face. However, we also know that he doesn't live very far away from the political machinations of the empire. He's one of them poor middle managers. He has a position of influence. He has partial, limited access to many of the decisions, many of the decrees. He knows the deeds of the king's business. But he's like many of you. He's one of the middle managers that gets grief from both sides. Verse number 11, even after Esther is taken into the king's palace, we see that Mordecai has close access, but not free access. It's limited. He walks back and forth before the courtyard of the women's house. He does not have direct access to the activities inside. He's completely dependent upon others to advise him. He must dispatch a messenger. Maybe a servant brings him news. Perhaps he sees the supplies that are brought in by the chamberlains, or he sees one of these other individuals taking out rubbish or bringing in food. Back in verse number 7, we've seen his lineage and his labor. Look at his love. Mordecai's chief concern is for a young orphaned girl who happens to be his cousin. Her name is Esther. Upon the passing of his uncle and his aunt, Scripture nor tradition gives us any kind of a description of their decease. Mordecai just adopts this young maiden as his very own. And his cousin, from verse 7, is now raised not as a cousin, but as his own daughter. The indication we have here is that he raises her from infancy. And so she's not familiar with her own parents, but the only parent she has known is this wise man named Mordecai. Understand this, biologically, this is Esther's cousin. But relationally, this is her dad. This is her father. And that brings us to the third character we see in this chapter, and that is a captivating maiden. Verse number 7, we're given her label. He brought up Hadassah. Hadassah is a Hebrew name. It's a Hebrew name which we would translate today as myrtle. Esther is actually a transliteration of a Persian word. Esther is her Persian name. It's transliterated for us. Her Persian name, Esther, is a transliteration of Ishtar, which means star. Now, interestingly enough, the myrtle bush is an evergreen that is originally from the Middle East, and it bears flowers that bloom in the shape of a star. They develop further into purple edible berries. Myrtle has been used since the ancient times as a symbol of love. How interesting. Are you catching more irony here? I don't know where we ever started using roses and other flowers, because culturally, historically, it's always been myrtle. So we're told here her Hebrew name, Hadassah, her Persian name, Esther. We're told in verse number 15 that she also has a dad. Her dad is Mordecai's uncle. He also has a name, Abihail. This was the uncle of Mordecai. And without going through all of the details as I did for Mordecai, let me just summarize it this way. Whatever the lineage of Mordecai in relation to the kings of Judah, it's the same lineage as Esther. Esther possesses this same pedigree from her natural father, and she has the same pedigree from her adoptive father. Pick whichever family lineage you like, it goes to the same person. Now, I wish I could skip some verses. Let's go back to verse 7. That's the lineage and the label of Esther. Let's look at her looks. Verse 7. In the middle, you see that the maid was fair and beautiful. This is a special description of the physical features. And this would not go unnoticed. It would not go without being very prominent for the original Jewish audience to which it was written. Again, let me remind you that when a new character is introduced, the most important, the most prominent feature for that character is always the one that is mentioned first. And here, upon the introduction of Hadassah, we see that it's Mordecai's cousin. She has no father or mother, so she's an orphan, and that she's fair and beautiful. And so Esther here is introduced as being completely qualified. May I be so bold as to say that she's overqualified for this law of capturing, which was passed earlier by our carnal king. I'll say this. Maid is the Hebrew word meaning simply girl or damsel or a young woman of marriageable age. Fair in the Hebrew is actually two words. It's translated here as one word in our King James Bible. It's actually two Hebrew words meaning fair of form. The word beautiful here, translated as one word in your King James Bible, is also two Hebrew words. And the two Hebrew words would literally be translated as beautiful of countenance or good of countenance. And it's a double description, if you will, of Esther's striking beauty, which would not go unnoticed by the original audience to whom this author is writing. The original text here makes no apology for the features which it is highlighting. It's a way of saying that she's not just a beautiful face, but she has the figure to match. Understand, however, that her beauty is not likely something that would be admired in our Western culture. Here in the Western civilization, thin is in, tan is terrific, and that seems to be the celebrated standard. These girls, as we'll see momentarily, go through a year of special diet and don't go in the sun. It's exactly the opposite of what we consider beautiful. And we'll see their preparation in the next section. But before we leave her lineage and her label and her looks, let me tell you about her leaning, because we're told something of her personality in the next several verses. In verses 8 through 10, we're told about her disposition, her personality, if you will. First of all, I want you to see that Esther is conforming. Verse number 8, it came to pass when the king's commandment and his decree was heard that many maidens were gathered together to Shushan, the palace, to the custody of Haggai. Esther was brought unto the king's house to the custody of Haggai, keeper of the women. The maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him. Notice in verse 10, Esther had not showed her people nor kindred. Mordecai charged her she should not show it. First of all, she's conforming. In verse 8, she was brought to the king's house to the custody of a man named Haggai. This is where some of the perplexities get difficult to understand. This verb is a passive voice, and so we know that she did not come voluntarily, but she was brought involuntarily to this place. So understand, this is not a beauty contest. The beautiful young women here were taken. There's no indication here that Mordecai enrolled. There's no indication that Mordecai offered or brought his cousin to the palace. I know that probably just destroyed everything you were told in Sunday school on the flannel graph, right? I mean, think about this. It would be unthinkable because Mordecai and Esther, father and daughter relationally, cousins biologically, they loved each other. And in this situation, they probably never get to see each other again in the normal course of how this would play out. So, she didn't come voluntarily, but there's also no indication that Esther or Mordecai resisted the conscription either. After all, think of this. They're not living in Jerusalem. Another question for later. They're living, because Mordecai is a middle manager and an officer of the palace, they're living very close to the palace. They're not far away from the kingdom where she can hide or where they have time to react to this new law. They're living right next to where the law is given, and it's like they have no time to evade or put in any other kind of plans in place. So resistance is futile. You must assimilate. You must not ever resist. So if you've been told this was a beauty contest, you've been given an incorrect notion. The king here sends out his jackbooted thugs to all the regions of the empire with nothing more than to conscript young, pretty girls into the service of his harem. That's what's going on. The entire scheme here is crafted by the 7 sleazy scumbags that we met in chapter 1 in an effort to try to make their families more powerful. And we'll come back here in a moment. I want you to see that Esther is also consenting to this. It seems that Esther was likely conscripted against her will, but it doesn't appear that she offered any sort of resistance. Why would that be? Well, maybe she remembered the queen and what happened to Vashti when she offered just a little bit of resistance and dared to say no. After all, we see that she was banished and she was married to the king. How can an orphan girl living outside the palace dare say no to the king, for which there is ultimate power? Resistance is not possible. The king's laws cannot be ignored. Maybe she just wanted to make the best of it. Notice in verse 9, Esther didn't resist Hegai, the eunuch in charge of the maiden harem. She was pleasing. She found favor. In verse 10, and we see again in verse number 20, that Esther keeps her nationality a secret. See, there's a number of circumstances here that indicate Esther is a nice girl. Simply meaning she's a rule follower who tries to be a people pleaser in all circumstances. And here we see the difficulty of drawing conclusions from this narrative without knowing the end of the book while you're reading the beginning. Because this is difficult to comprehend until you know the end, isn't it? Let's look at the contest. It gets worse. And we can't skip these verses. So we'll just try to wade through them, and y'all throw me a life preserver, okay? The participation here, the prerequisite. Verse 8, it came to pass when the king's commandment, his decree was heard, many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace to the custody of Hegai. Esther was brought also to the king's house to the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women. The maiden pleased him. Verse 10, Esther keeps her people and her kindred a secret. Mordecai does the same thing in verse number 11. Verse 12, now when every maid's turn was come to go into King Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months, according to the manner of the women, so were the days of purification, 6 months oil of myrrh, 6 months sweet odors, other things for purifying women. Then every maiden was taken to the king. Whatever she wanted, whatever she desired was given to her out of the house of the women unto the king's house. Verse 14 has a lot of difficulties for us, doesn't it, for a young Jewish girl? In the evening she went. On the morrow she returned to the second house of the women to go to the custody of a different chamberlain, Shazgaz, which kept the concubines. And she came to the king no more, except he delighted in her and called her by name. The participation here, the prerequisite is, as we said earlier, the only prerequisite is that she must be young, beautiful, and available. We see that in verse number 8. Can you imagine this decree being sent forth? All of your young girls are now mine. If they're young, if they're pretty, and if they're unmarried, they're coming to the king. Imagine that going forth to all of the regions. Now, we mentioned last week that he had very similar to what we would have in a Pony Express that could get this announcement to all of the regions of the empire in just a matter of a day or two. I can imagine that some girls may have gotten married almost immediately. An arranged marriage is fine. I mean, anything is better than that, right? I mean, let's marry off all of our daughters to any young unmarried man. Let's make them unavailable in an attempt to avoid this situation. What does this say about the young girls that are not taken? Imagine the stigma of being unmarried and not taken. Am I not pretty enough? Am I not young enough? What's wrong with me? Now, if I'm not married and I'm not taken, will I ever be married? How's that for a stigma? This leaves us questions everywhere, doesn't it? Let's look at the preparation. Verse number 12, every maid's turn. So were the days of the purifications accomplished, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with sweet odors and other things for the purifying of the women. A full year of preparing, and you think it takes your wife a long time to get ready. 12 months. 12 months with oil of myrrh, split up between myrrh and sweet odors. And what we have here is a 12-month-long beauty treatment. In other words, what the king has done is he sent his thugs to all of the regions to find the most eligible, the prettiest, youngest girls available everywhere in the region. But yet you come into the king's harem, and that's not good enough. You've still got to be primped, pampered, and prepared for a full year before you meet the king. The pomp of this guy. It's a 12-month-long beauty treatment to prepare each one of these young ladies. And just to be honest with you, it's for one night with the king. And remember again, what the Western culture considers beautiful is not what Persian kings would have considered beautiful. It's a 12-month program. It includes a prescribed diet. Remember when we studied through Daniel? What did Daniel and his 3 friends do? Chapter 1 of Daniel. We're not going to participate with the king's food. Daniel purposed in his heart not to defile himself with the king's food, with the portion of the king's meat. We're not eating that junk. Rule number 1, when these young, pretty virgins are brought into the king's house to prepare for their night with the king, special diet. There's special treatments of ointment here, perfumes. Many times tradition says that these ladies would sit under a tent of sorts. It's kind of a tarp or a tent, and they would burn incense, and this incense would then infiltrate their whole bodies, and they would do this for months on end just to smell good. And I'm very sensitive to just a little bit of perfume. I mean, I don't know. This training program would consist of an entire course on court etiquette. You must know never to look at the king directly in the eye. It's considered a challenge. Never approach the throne unsummoned. It's treason. Never even think about not submitting. If you fail to submit to the king in all things, you'll be banished, just like Queen Vashti. Back in verse number 9, Esther had made friends with Haggai, overseer of this harem. So in addition to this training, Haggai gives her 7 maidens to assist in her further training. She's getting the advanced class, right? I mean, I don't want to go too far, but let me just say this. Haggai knows what the king likes. You're going to the special place. You're getting 7 helpers. You're getting the special training. So he gives her the best portions. He's sending her to the best quarters in the best part of the palace. And this entire saga is human trafficking. Okay? And in this whole saga of human trafficking, you might be inclined to call this grooming. I know, if anybody watches this on YouTube, I got preachers all over the country throwing rocks at me now. But that's what this is. There's no way to whitewash this. Verses 13 through 16, go read this for yourself. These inexperienced young maidens are given extensive training for one function: satisfy the sensual desires of a carnal, corrupt king for one encounter. Now, I don't know how they're chosen. I don't know how the order was given. I don't know how the order was set. But I can tell you this. On one hand, it doesn't matter, and it's irrelevant to our story. It's irrelevant to the narrative. On the other hand, we don't know what's working in the background, in the many miraculous, seemingly coincidental occurrences. We know that later it's just going to be coincidental that a king has insomnia. We don't know what's going on the very time that Esther's name comes up. Whatever this girl decided to take with her was granted when it was her turn. Jewels, clothes, perfumes, trinkets, flowers. We're not given any clues. We're not given any hints. We know from verse 13 and verse 14, whenever she left the house of the women in the evening, she went to the king's house. It's an all-night encounter. Whatever the king's carnal mind could conjure up. In the morning, she's now sent to the second house. She doesn't go back there. She goes to the second house of the women. A separate house with a separate chamberlain. To drive the point home, the author gives us that his name is a different name. Here's the plight that they want you to see. This girl, having been abused by the king all night, is now no longer free to leave. She's no longer free to marry. She is now the king's concubine for the rest of her life. And if that sounds appealing, that you can go and you can live in all this luxury in the king's house, she's regulated to the second house in a harem of concubines. Her future is nothing but a life of sequestered separation. She belongs to the king. She is his toy. She is his plaything. But she no longer has any access. These women may be pampered, but it's a life of perpetual loneliness. However, she has responsibility. Keep yourself prepared just in case the king might call your name. But it's not likely. Because here's the problem. With such unbridled lust, the king would soon get bored. He probably can't distinguish one maiden from another maiden, let alone recall their names. Besides, there's more waiting. Wiersbe says it this way: this is not love, it's a faceless, anonymous lust that he craves more, and the more he indulges, the less he is satisfied. I want you to understand that. If you happen to be here and you face a lust problem like this king faces a lust problem, I want you to understand that the more you indulge, the less you are satisfied. Even after Queen Esther is crowned, here's a detail that we so often read over and we miss. Verse number 19, even after Esther is crowned, Ahasuerus continues his sensual craving, and he has a second hurting of the virgins. You want another question that I can't answer? This time it seems like Mordecai is sitting in the gate. I guess he's looking the other way. I know there's more intense questions that we can't answer about this book. It certainly doesn't make Esther and Mordecai look like righteous people at this time, does it? At this point, it appears they're either complicit in the corruptions or at minimum, they're unconcerned. We see Mordecai just looking the other way. Let me read you from Karen Jacobs. She seems to be the eminent scholar on this book. She says this situation offends our modern sensibilities, and feminist critics especially see this as demeaning and sexist affront to women that the biblical author should have denounced. However, she also goes on to describe that at least 500 young boys were also gathered annually, and they were turned into eunuchs, let me say it that way. They were turned into eunuchs to serve the Persian court. And so she then says that one might argue that the young women actually got the better deal. So this isn't a beauty contest that most have pictured from the days of their youth. What's described here is an insatiable appetite for sensual gratification, and it's repulsive to our conscience, and it should be. But it demonstrates here for us how ultimate power was wielded by the Persian king, and everybody, males and females, were at the disposal of the king's whim. And that's what makes the coming event so incredible, that God uses two people to overturn these events. Look at the coronation. We'll hurry through the remainder of what we read here. The coronation of Queen Esther. Verses 15 and 16, we see the feat. How did this king get conquered? Again, in verse 15 and 16, we see that Esther's name was chosen. We don't know how, but when she goes in to the king, she has a meeting with Haggai, the king's chamberlain. Esther was taken into King Ahasuerus in the house royal in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. This is a time that's known with very certainty. After these things, again, chapter 2 is the 7th year of King Xerxes. This time period is 4 years after chapter 1. So Xerxes has left the palace of Sardis in September of 479 BC, and he's arrived in Susa. So these events, we know exactly. They happened either in December of 479 or in January of 478 BC. We know exactly when this happened. When Esther's turn arrived, here's something different that happened. Esther doesn't ask for anything special. She just puts herself into the care of Haggai, and she trusts his advice. She trusts his appointment. And this appears to be another one of Esther's neutral manners. She's either ambivalent to whether she pleases the king or persuades the king. We're not told whether Esther cares one way or the other. It's almost like let's get this over with. We're not given that she resists, but we're also told that she doesn't require anything. There's just nothing here. Okay? But then in verse 17, the king loved Esther above all the women. She finds favor. She obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So Esther obtains favor in the sight of all that looks on her. Esther obtained grace and favor in the sight of the king. Favor means kindness. It's another act of providence by a sovereign God on behalf of his people. The king loved Esther here. Now, understand the Hebrew language is pretty clear. It probably means that he responded to Esther with greater enthusiasm than he did any of the others. The phrase that the king loved Esther should not be misinterpreted, that Xerxes all of a sudden fell madly in love with Esther, and he discovered pure and undevoted affection, and they lived happily ever after. This is not the fairy tale. Okay? I give you the title, Beauty and the Beast. That's not how this story ended. It's not that he fell in love with her and they lived happily ever after and became a nice couple. If that was the case, then there's no explanation for verse 19. when he has a second gathering to go repopulate his virgin harem yet again. I think verse 19 is included to show us, again, the ambivalence of Mordecai to all the wickedness around him. I mean, folks still don't know that he's a Jew. That's coming in the coming chapters. What's happening here is Esther's given a royal crown. The crown that is removed has been repossessed. It's restricted from Vashti. It's repossessed, and it's placed upon Esther. And Esther is now given the estate of the queen. She is given a new queen. And now, feast. Number 4. Hey, we got another reason for a party, right? Another reason for a banquet. This is the 4th banquet. This is the 4th book, or the 4th party in the book. Verse 18 calls it Esther's feast. All of the princes, all of the servants are invited. Again, it's probably the same ones that we met in chapter 1. And so we see another law passed by this king, sent by courier, sent by this pony express throughout the entire kingdom. Esther is queen. Release the provinces. The Hebrew word here for rest is the same word that is told us in verse 18, he made a release to the provinces. It's the Hebrew word that we see so often translated for rest. The king gave them rest. And so this rest provided relief from the top of the hierarchy all the way down to the lowest common vassal of the kingdom. There's a national holiday. We see a distribution of gifts, cancellation of taxes. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? Only for this year. A cancellation of taxes for this year, which is going to be very important in the coming chapters. Likely all the servants are released. The workers are given a vacation. If you're familiar with the Jewish year of Jubilee, this king's edict upon the coronation of Queen Esther is very much like the year of Jubilee. Slaves are set free, servants are set free, workers are given a vacation, taxes are canceled, all the debts are forgiven. Let's have a celebration. I've got a new queen. Oh, but things are going to change. Quickly, I want to go over some of our cultural difficulties, because the cultural difficulties we see in this chapter are the spiritual difficulties that abound for us. The first one I see here is, are they Jewish or are they not? Are Mordecai and Esther Jews or are they not? I mean, they claim to be Jewish, and the author introduces us here as, and gives us their Jewish lineage, but nobody knows about it. Nobody knows Mordecai's ancestry until he reveals it to them, and that's not coming until the next chapter. The king doesn't learn about Esther's ancestry until much later. That's chapter 7 at another feast. Mordecai and Esther, at least through this part of the story, are intentionally hiding their nationality from everybody around them. What does that say to us? Mordecai has commanded Esther to conceal her nationality. He's done the same thing. We're told that twice in this chapter. So this father and daughter pair had not been practicing any sort of Jewish faith. They're not following the dietary laws. They're not following the sacrificial laws. They're not following anything. They had assimilated into the culture of the Persians. You know how far they had assimilated to the culture of the Persians? Esther is a Persian name after the Persian goddess of fertility, Ishtar. Mordecai is a Persian name after the Persian god, Marduk. They had accepted Persian names after Persian gods, for crying out loud. The dietary laws are forsaken. The rules for separation ignored. The worship of God has been abandoned. And are they unique in this? We have a different example. I mentioned Daniel and his 3 friends from Daniel chapter 1. They were very careful to obey the dietary laws of Israel. Even during their deportation, God rewarded them for their faithfulness. Had any of that been practiced during the year of preparation, Esther's identity would have been known, wouldn't it? So evidently this concealment continues on for another 4 years, which again, you need to read the rest of the story because we find out next week that it's 4 more years before they know their identity. So Esther and Mordecai aren't actively following God's laws in their daily life, are they? They're living like pagans in a pagan culture. So is that immoral or is that not immoral? Because bigger than concealing their national and their family background is their moral compromise here. I mean, we can ask what a Jewish young girl is doing in a pagan king's harem. Another situation like this happened back in Israel. They killed themselves. They wouldn't submit. Which one's right and which one's wrong? Not easy questions, are they? I told you this book had more questions for us. The moral law clearly prohibited all kinds of illicit sex, mixed marriages between Jews and non-Jews. You can go read Leviticus 18. Was she right or was she wrong? So are they royal or are they not royal? I mean, why are they even there? If those two were really faithful to God, why had they not returned to their homeland to reestablish the temple and the worship? I mean, Zerubbabel has already led 50,000 Jews back to Jerusalem years before. And so if they were good, faithful Jews, why didn't they go back to Jerusalem with Zerubbabel? Because that's God's chosen people, right? God's chosen people are only in God's chosen homeland. So they should be back in Jerusalem with Zerubbabel. Why are they even in the pagan court? Well, not to be too quick to judge, but Ezra, the man Ezra, yeah, he's living here too at the time. And we have a book named after him. He hadn't returned yet either. In fact, Ezra wouldn't happen to return until 458 BC. We know the year that happens. That's 21 years later. And that's 14 years after King Ahasuerus is assassinated and his son Artaxerxes, son of Vashti, ascends to the throne. And so we know that Mordecai and Esther are not alone. There's a large number of Jews who did not return with Zerubbabel at the first opportunity. There's a large number who are still living here that return with Ezra 21 years later. And there's a large group that stays even after that. One of them, you might know his name. It's Nehemiah, who writes a book that gets included in the Bible. So these aren't simple questions, are they? So did they compromise or did they not compromise? Is there spiritual compromise? Is there moral compromise? Is there a loyalty compromise here? You see, the real issue in this narrative is, does God protect his people, his covenant chosen people? We know the answer to that question, don't we? The answer is an uncompromising yes. He absolutely does protect his covenant people. But you know where the rubber meets the road? Who are his covenant people? We think we know. They thought they knew. When King Jehoiachin was carried away out of Jerusalem, was that the end of God's covenant? When the Jewish citizens that were allowed to return to their homeland under Zerubbabel left, some chose to stay behind. Who's God's chosen people? With whom did God make a covenant? The ones that considered themselves faithful and went back to Jerusalem and said, we don't know those people anymore? And the ones that are left now in Persia, they decided to stay behind. Are they stragglers? Are they strangers to the covenant? Were those who stayed back still part of God's covenant community? That's why I encourage you to read the end of this book while we struggle with these questions. It helps us to have the answer so that we can work through the proof. See, ultimately we know the answer that God will protect his people. Yes, even those that are in exile, even those who live a life that doesn't demonstrate their commitment. But he does so because he's faithful, not because we're faithful. He does so because it's his covenant. It's not our covenant. He does so for his glory, not for our glory. And we're a bunch of snooty Baptists that think we've got all the answers. They didn't know until they had the end of the story. And my proposal to you is, you don't know because you don't have the end of the story. See, those questions are relevant for us today because we as a community of faithful understand that God can protect us and God will protect us. And he will do so in a land that is increasingly hostile towards our message. And they are indicting to us when we try to be different. Is that relevant to us? I'm telling you it is. Just say no to someone that tries to force you with a mandate against your will. See what happens. And that's just one that's relevant recently, but I can pick a dozen examples for you. Become a witness at work. You're not going to bring comfort. You're going to bring more problems. You're not going to bring peace. You're going to bring a challenge. You're going to bring a sword to your house. You stand up against the abuses of an exploited ethnic group like these people. When you stand up against the abuses of an exploited ethnic group, you're going to be maligned right along with them. And so we cope with some of these issues, don't we? And we find ourselves in a similar position to the Jews of Esther's day. Yes, we are taught to separate ourselves from the world, and we should. Romans 12, verse 2, be not conformed to this world, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. But just like Mordecai here, Mordecai is very wise, and he struggled with the question of how do we be in the world, but not be of the world. That's our struggle today. Should we be distinct in clothing? Should we be distinct in our language? Should we be distinct in our customs? Because when we're not, we blend in. But when we are, we've ostracized ourselves. And we need to be wise and know where to blend, and we need to be wise and know where to stick out, right? So when we fail in that area, are we compromising? When we compromise, are we no longer faithful to the community of Christ? And that's where we become so judgmental and we become snooty Baptists because we see somebody else that chooses a path that's just a little bit different than our own. God's not dealing with them anymore. They're not part of our community. We do it as churches. You take a church that believes just a little bit different than we do, we're not fellowshipping with them anymore. We're not taking their letters. Somebody goes and joins that church, we'll never talk to them again. We do it as individuals. Take somebody that believes just a little bit different than we do. On entertainment, do we go to movies? Do we not? Do we listen to this music? Do we not? Do we dress this way? Do we not? And if they disagree with us, well, they might be in my church, but I'm not going to fellowship with them. You think Esther and Mordecai had to deal with those issues? You see, here in America, it's real easy for us to have some heated arguments about how we dress, what music we listen to, what entertainment, where we go, what we do. We run for public office or do we not? Can you be faithful to Christ if you disagree with my opinion? Can you be faithful to Christ and disagree with my perspective or, heaven forbid, my interpretation? You know why we argue about that? Because you've never been faced with a life and death situation over the answer. And the real truth is, we don't really stick out from society that much anyway. In most other nations, and more so in our own nation, you know what happens? You pound the nail that sticks out. Do you ever think about that? And so what's unfaithful and what's prudent? Your situation is different from mine. Your circumstances are different from mine. And you have to wrestle with that question. Now, please understand, I want to be very, very clear. And we heard this in Sunday school this morning. Our decisions, when we sin and we knowingly sin, it costs us, and it costs us in ways that we can't imagine and we can't get back and we can't ever correct. So I'm not saying And I am not justifying sin, not at all. But what I am saying is sometimes we get real judgmental about little small differences, and we haven't seen the end of God's providence in his people that are working out his promises. And right about now, you probably think Esther and Mordecai aren't very nice folks. And that tide's going to turn. That tide's going to change. But the point here of this is they're caught up in the always changing tide, the whims of an Eastern monarch, and that monarch can never be opposed. And so at this point in time, since we know the end of the story, we don't really condemn Esther and Mordecai for what happened, and we know that mostly these events right now in the early chapters of Esther is out of their control. But yet we go about condemning our brothers and sisters for a lot of things that are out of their control. And we condemn God's people for whom God is still working his promises through his providence for the good of his people. And we haven't seen the end of that story yet. That's my challenge. Because I get real judgmental at times. I get real short-sighted at times. And we need to have the long sight, the long picture in view. So please don't misunderstand that I'm justifying sin. I'm not. But I can tell you this. Even when you have sinned, even when you have messed up and you've made a mess, it's never a reason to give up, because God's going to change this tide in their narrative, in their life. And no matter how far astray we've gone, God can turn things around and make things right. Let's stand. Brother Derek, if you'll come, lead us in a